Hercule Poirot and the Day After Diary. Chapter 1. The Garden After the Rain. The rain had stopped at dawn, leaving a damp, silvery glow on the lawn of Villa-Lavande. The drops still hung from the leaves of the rose bushes, like diamonds suspended in balance. Madame Vernet, the elegant widow of a wealthy Parisian publisher, sipped her coffee on the glassed-in terrace, gazing out at the garden with a mixture of melancholy and calculation. It was Tuesday. At 9:20, the maid screamed, "Madame!" in the pavilion at the back. "It's Mr. Davenant." Dressed in a silk dressing-gown and with her hair freshly tied, Madame Vernet went down to the garden, accompanied by the butler. There, in the small guest pavilion surrounded by wisteria, lay the lifeless body of Philippe Davenant, her stepson. His head rested on the desk, a dark stain soaking the lapel of his grey jacket. Beside him, an open diary, the written page, dated for the following day. "My death will be more useful than my life." 3 hours later, at the quiet Aix-les-Bains station, a train from Lyon was lazily releasing steam. A short man with an oval head and a carefully waxed moustache stepped out of one of the carriages. He wore an immaculate light grey linen suit, a navy blue tie, and a white carnation in his lapel. His gait was precise, and his eyes, although hidden behind round sunglasses, moved with acute alertness. "Finally, Hastings, I assure you there's nothing as healthy as mountain air. Unless, of course, there's an intriguing crime to wake up the little grey cells." Captain Hastings, older, a little greyer, but still a faithful chronicler and companion in mental battles, smiled with resignation. "And you say you received Madame Vernet's letter this very morning?" "Last night, mon ami," with unusual urgency and a tone that suggests a deeper theatre than a simple murder. "A theatre? Exactly. A carefully staged scenario. A dead young man, a diary dated for tomorrow, and a woman accustomed to control. Hastings, I can already hear the melody of deception." Villa-Lavande was a miniature palace, tucked away among the hills bordering Lake Bourget. Servants waited formally at the foot of the steps, and Madame Vernet greeted them in person. She was a spirited woman despite her age, with perfectly coiled grey hair and a voice that suggested she brooked no errors in either grammar or morals. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, taking both his hands, "I need your mind. The Chambéry police are insisting on suicide." Suicide! Philippe would never have written something so melodramatic, let alone dated for the next day. Poirot nodded gently, as if he already knew the answer. "We'll have to see the body, the diary, and the people who shared this house with Monsieur Davenant." The inhabitants of Villa-Lavande were not many, but they were varied. First, Mademoiselle Léa Fauconnier, the deceased's fiancée, a young woman with a pale face and dark eyebrows, who had not shed a tear, although her hands trembled as she held her teacup. Next up was Dr. Clément Artaud, the family doctor and an old friend of Philippe's. Father, a 60-year-old man with a deep voice and an evasive gaze. And finally, Pierre Vignal, a distant cousin, invited by Madame Vernet herself to help with her late husband's archives. Poirot looked at each one like a painter evaluating colours before beginning his work. His moustache twitched slightly as they spoke, and his small black leather notebook recorded minimal notes. When he looked around the ward where the body was found, he didn't touch anything. He paused at the desk, bowed his head as if listening to a silent confession, and finally murmured, "A scene too perfect, isn't it?" As if the culprit knew the police would only look at the surface. Hastings raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think of the newspaper? A clue, not written for the reader, but for the wrong reader. Hastings, the killer, wanted someone else to see those words, not us." When the police returned that afternoon, Poirot politely asked them not to touch anything else at the scene. Inspector Giraud, an old acquaintance, snorted. "Another of your theatrical theories, Poirot. The young man committed suicide. He was in debt, arguing with his stepmother, and that diary says it all." Poirot simply smiled. "But yes, Inspector. Sometimes the culprit screams too loudly to be believed." That night, while the others slept, Poirot strolled slowly through the lantern-lit garden. He paused in front of the wisteria of the pavilion and examined the frame of a low window. Something made him stop, a faint trace of disturbed earth next to the hedge gate. Bending down, Poirot picked up a button, small, mother of pearl. "So," he said, putting it away carefully, "the first thread of the tapestry has been found." And as the night breeze shook the rose bushes, Hercule Poirot returned to the house, his little grey cells already active, weaving the logic behind the tragedy. Chapter 2. The Faces Behind the Mask. The next morning dawned serene, with a timid sun breaking through the clouds still hovering over the Alps. Poirot woke up early, as usual, and spent a full hour perfecting his moustache. Hastings, after his morning walk, found him in the dining room, slowly leafing through a small book of poetry. "Poetry, Poirot?" "Yes, my friend, because words, even in their most artistic form, can reveal hidden intentions. Like a diary written for the future. Do you still think it wasn't suicide?" Poirot turned away, leaving the closed book on the table. "Hastings, have you ever seen a man decide to die, and write it in advance, leaving a record for after his departure? That's not desperation, that's theatre. And who else but an actor writes for an audience?" After breakfast, Poirot asked to speak to Léa Fauconnier in the greenhouse, a large space filled with ferns, jasmine, and a wrought iron bench. She greeted him with a neutral expression, although her eyes revealed a suppressed storm. "Miss Fauconnier," Poirot began gently, "were you aware that Philippe had written something the previous evening?" She hesitated for a moment. "I suspected as much. He didn't have dinner with us. He told me he needed to sort his thoughts out, but I didn't think it was." Her voice broke for the first time. "You loved him, didn't you?" "With all my heart, although I don't know if he could love anyone. Philippe, he was broken inside." Poirot tilted his head. "Why do you say that? His childhood was complicated. His father became stern after the death of his first wife. Madame Vernet was always distant with him, and he became volatile, almost cruel at times. He had enemies, though few knew it." Poirot remained reflectively silent. "And friends?" Léa hesitated. "One, Pierre. They played together as children, but in the last few months they barely spoke. Poirot found Pierre Vignal in the library. He was leafing through a volume on art history, though clearly more interested in conversation than reading. "A splendid place," Poirot commented, sitting opposite him. "It reminds me of certain houses on the Loire, although less warmth." "Madame Vernet isn't exactly warm," Pierre replied with a half-smile. "How would you describe Philippe?" "Brilliant, unstable, proud, always convinced he had something to prove. He never forgave his father for not considering him his natural successor at the publishing house. And yet you were the one who inherited the late editor's archives." Pierre raised his eyebrows. "Just as a temporary favour, I'm sorting through paperwork. Nothing important." Poirot bowed slightly. "And where were you last night between 9 and 10? Pierre did not hesitate. "In my room, going through some letters. You can ask the maid. She brought me some tea shortly before 10. "Thank you, I will." Dr. Artaud was in his private office, writing something in a notebook. Seeing Poirot, he stood up with the stiffness of a man who dislikes interruptions. "I'm not a policeman, Doctor," Poirot said, raising his hands. "Just a humble observer. You knew Philippe well, didn't you? Since I was a kid. He had a difficult temperament. Intelligent, yes, but impulsive. And lately, more paranoid than usual. Paranoid. I thought someone was following him. He told me his mail was being checked, that someone was trying to discredit him in Paris. Honestly, I thought it was just stress. Did you have access to the ward where the body was found?" "We all had it, although I doubt anyone visited it at that hour." Poirot thanked him and left. In his room, Poirot sat reviewing his notes. The diary remained the crux of the enigma, dated for the future, written in fluid black ink, without erasures. Every word seemed measured. That wasn't desperation, but calculation. "Hastings," he finally called, "come with me to the pavilion once more. I need to see something in the midday light." Philippe's desk was just as they had left it. Poirot examined the underside, bending down with difficulty until his finger touched a small scratch on the wood. "See this, my friend? Someone removed and replaced one of the legs. Why? Maybe to hide something inside. I need a screwdriver." With Hastings's help, they removed the bottom cover of the hollow leg. Inside, carefully rolled up, was a note. "They left me no choice. If this is found, they'll know I wasn't free to decide." Poirot sat up with a grim expression. So, the secret testimony. Hastings, the victim, left not a farewell note, but a warning. This wasn't a suicide. This was a cold-blooded white-glove crime. And with that certainty, Poirot felt that the case, like a closed flower, was finally beginning to open its petals. Chapter 3. Shadows on Paper. That afternoon, as the cicadas buzzed lazily among the garden bushes, Poirot requested a private table in the small adjoining dining room. There, with a cup of bergamot tea and his notebook, he began to sketch the first profiles of each of the inhabitants of Villa Lavande. Not with data, but with psychological details. For Poirot, the mind was always more revealing than schedules. Captain Hastings, somewhat uneasy, looked out the window. I can't help but find it curious that everyone, to a greater or lesser extent, seemed comfortable with Philippe's death. Ah, my friend, a keen observation. No one has truly wept. No one has shown the kind of emotion I would expect in the face of sudden tragedy. What does that tell us? That they didn't want it, or that they feared him? Or perhaps that they knew something we haven't heard yet. Poirot drummed his fingers on the rim of the cup. That diary hidden in the leg of the desk. It wasn't written in desperation. It was written with the precision of someone planning to reveal something, but was forced to keep quiet. What if they forced him to write it? A possibility I don't rule out. But there's a more subtle detail that disturbs me. Which? The diary dated for the next day. Who writes that? Only someone who wants to provoke a reaction later, as if they wanted to manipulate the story of their own death. Poirot asked the maid, Odette, to accompany him for a brief chat. She was a nervous young woman with a wrinkled apron and a shifty gaze. "Odette, did you bring tea to Mr. Vignal last night?" "Yes, sir, at 9:45. "Did he go into your room?" "Just enough to leave the tray on the table." "He was writing." "And did you notice anything unusual?" "Nothing, except that I'd left the window open and it was cold. He seemed uneasy. He said to me, 'Tomorrow everything will change.' And then he laughed strangely." Poirot made a small note. "Thank you, mademoiselle. One last question. Was anyone else awake at that hour?" "I think I heard footsteps on the north gallery, but I couldn't say who. I don't like to pry, monsieur. An admirable virtue, although in this case it would have been useful." That afternoon, Poirot asked to examine the papers Philippe had been sorting through before his death. Madame Vernet agreed with some reluctance. "You'll have to talk to Pierre. He has the keys to the archive." Pierre didn't object. He led him to the west wing of the villa, where in a climate-controlled room lined with shelves lay hundreds of folders organized with fastidious precision. In one corner, a cardboard box contained loose, unfiltered documents. I found them on Philippe's desk. They looked like notes for an article, or maybe a book. Poirot took out several papers. One immediately caught his eye. A sheet with the word testament underlined several times. Below is a list of names: Vignal, Falconer, Vernet, and then A confidential, pending confirmation. Aha! Poirot murmured, a fourth person, unidentified, or perhaps protected. He reviewed another sheet of paper with dates and bank transfers, some large sums, all from the same account, Philippe's late father's. A recent transfer, not officially reported, was marked with a cross. "Hastings," he said without looking up. "A more concrete reason is beginning to emerge. Money, the eternal reason." That evening, during dinner, Poirot asked everyone to gather in the main hall. Not for an accusation, not yet, he clarified with a friendly smile, but to get to know each other a little better. After all, it is in tragedy that character is revealed, isn't it? The living room was lit by floor lamps and a soft fire in the fireplace. Madame Vernet maintained her upright demeanour. Léa seemed distracted, and Pierre was uncomfortably serene. "Let me reflect briefly," Poirot began. "Sometimes a crime isn't what it seems. Sometimes it's committed long before the victim dies. It's committed with a decision, with silence, with a signature." "Are you suggesting something, monsieur?" Pierre interrupted. "I'm suggesting that Philippe d'Avernay wasn't a victim of himself, but of a chain of decisions that someone here set in motion. Decisions that included emotional manipulation, withholding information, and perhaps a very powerful financial incentive." "And what would those decisions be?" Madame Vernet asked coldly. Poirot stood up elegantly. "That, madame, I'll tell you soon. But first I must speak to a notary, review a will, and find out why Philippe was so dreading the next day." He bowed politely. "Sleep peacefully tonight, if you can." And with that, Poirot withdrew, leaving behind him a thick silence, heavy with unspoken suspicions and truths that were beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Chapter 4. The Testament that nobody read. The morning brought with it a low mist that hung like a veil over the box hedges of Villa Lavande. Poirot, punctual as ever, descended into the main hall, already dressed in a navy blue suit, holding his amber-handled walking stick. At 8 o'clock sharp, he requested a ride to the local notary's office in Chambéry. Hastings, resigned but curious, accompanied him without complaint. "And why the notary so suddenly, Poirot?" "Because, mon ami, Philippe mentioned the word will in his notes. And because money, as I said, always leaves a trace. I want to know who had the most to gain from his death. Isn't it always like this?" Poirot smiled. "Almost always. But the interesting thing is who thought that was going to inherit, and who discovered that it wasn't so." Maître Laval's office was an austere one, with dark bookshelves and the smell of old parchment. The notary, a meticulous and somewhat fussy man, greeted them courteously. Philippe d'Avernay made a new will. 2 weeks ago, he revealed. It replaced an old one, in which the majority of his assets went to his fiancée, Miss Fauconnier. And the new one? He redirected the funds, part of it to literary charities, and the rest to a person whose identity he asked me to keep confidential until his formal reading. "Don't you even know who he is?" Hastings asked, incredulous. "I know the name, of course, but I haven't told anyone, as I should. The will was supposed to be made public this Friday. Now, it will be sooner." Poirot was silent for a few seconds, then said gravely, "Just tell me this, Monsieur Laval. Is the new beneficiary inside Villa Lavande?" The notary nodded slowly. "Yes, without a doubt." When they returned to the villa, Poirot asked that no one leave. He sent a message to Madame Vernet, requesting a private conversation. She accepted, albeit with an impatient gesture. "Mr. Poirot, do you still consider this to be murder?" "I consider it a construction, a work in progress, the pavilion, the diary, the carefully drawn ink. Do you want to know what finally convinced me?" Illustreme Poirot bowed slightly. "The date. No one planning to take their own life writes their last entry for the next day, unless they know they'll die before then. That tells me someone wrote under duress, or expected to die through some means beyond their control. Are you implying that I—" "No, madam. I'm implying that someone knew that will would change the fate of more than one person. Someone who couldn't afford to wait until Friday." Poirot then called Léa Fauconnier. He found her sitting in the greenhouse, absorbed in a letter which she made no attempt to hide. "A letter from Philippe?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "I got it yesterday. I didn't want to read it until this morning. I'm afraid of what it might contain. Can I see her?" Léa handed it to him, trembling. Poirot read it silently. It was an ambiguous, affectionate letter, but laced with guilt. "I can't marry you knowing what I know now. You don't deserve to bear my shadow." "Curious," Poirot murmured. Philippe discovered something. Something that made him give you up, mademoiselle, or was it to protect you? I don't understand. Sometimes true love doesn't withdraw from a lack of affection, but from too much danger. At noon, Poirot returned to the pavilion. This time he went straight to the wooden cupboard in the corner. He examined the lock, touched the hinges, then carefully checked the frame. Finally, with a faint click, he released a hidden tab. Behind the panel, he found a file sealed with a blue linen thread. So, whisper. Inside were copies of old financial statements, along with a series of letters between Philippe and his late father. One highlighted line caught Poirot's eye. And if I ever find out that someone in this house has tampered with my decisions, I will do what is necessary to protect what belongs to me. Below, an unsigned letter added, "You can't change the will without consequences. You won't be forgiven." Poirot closed the folder and held it in both arms. "Now I have the motive, Hastings. Not the emotion, but the interest. Calculated, cold, and deeply hidden. And who? I won't reveal it yet. Not yet. But I promise you that when I do, it won't be an accusation. It will be an indirect confession." That evening, Poirot wrote several letters and hand-delivered them to each of the inhabitants. He asked them to meet in the living room the next day at 10 o'clock. "What are you planning, Poirot?" Hastings asked. "No theatrics, mon ami. Just the truth. And by the time I'm done, the culprit will no longer have a mask to use." With one last glance at the fake diary, still safely stored in his room, Poirot turned off the lamp. In his mind, all the pieces on the board were already in place. Only the last move remained. Chapter 5. The Truth Through Silence. At 10 o'clock sharp, the great hall of Villa Lavande was completely silent. Everyone invited was present, gathered around the marble fireplace, although the fire was not burning. The air was tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Poirot entered with a firm stride, followed by Hastings, carrying a small leather briefcase and wearing an expression of absolute composure. Madame Vernet sat in the central armchair, her chin raised like a queen on her throne. Léa Fauconnier gazed at her clasped hands without looking up. Pierre Vignal, his legs crossed, tried to appear calm, though his fingers drummed rhythmically. Dr. Artaud, for his part, assumed his usual air of weary authority. Poirot stopped, in front of everyone. He placed the briefcase on a low table, opened it, and took out 3 items: Philippe's diary, the letter Léa had found, and the secret folder from the cupboard. my lords," he began solemnly, "I thank you for your presence. I promised you that today we would speak of the truth. Not a judicial truth, not yet, but the truth that beats beneath your silences." "Do you want to accuse us all, Monsieur Poirot?" Pierre interrupted with a sardonic smile. "No, Monsieur Vignal. I only want to reveal what you already know, but haven't said." Poirot picked up Philippe's diary. This was written to be found, dated for the future, calculated, not a lament, but a warning. Philippe didn't take his own life. He was induced to create the illusion of suicide, because someone here desperately needed his death to appear voluntary. He placed the diary on the table and took out the letter he had read in the greenhouse. This letter, addressed to Miss Fauconnier, confirms that Philippe was disturbed, but not by love, but by recent discoveries. Discoveries that changed his perception of his surroundings. People he believed to be loyal, but weren't. He took a step closer, and here, in this hidden folder, we find the root of the crime. A series of transactions that demonstrate the existence of financial manipulations within the Davenay publishing house just before the death of Philippe's father, a fraud carefully concealed, and Philippe had discovered it. Léa looked up in surprise. A fraud? Yes, and now, by elimination, only 3 people had access to the publishing house's original archives: Philippe, Dr. Artaud, as executor of the father's will, and you, Monsieur Vignal, as the recent organizer of the documents. Pierre tensed, but didn't reply. Poirot continued. Philippe threatened to expose the forgery. He changed his will, removing from the list those who directly or indirectly would benefit from his silence. That's why he received threats. And that's why, 2 weeks later, he died. And how can you prove he was murdered? Madame Vernet asked, unfazed. Because the poison found in her system, scopolamine, is not a common means of suicide. It dissolves in liquids, impairs judgment, and creates suggestion. It leaves no obvious traces when ingested in minimal doses. Ideal for getting someone to write down what someone else wants, without fully understanding what they're doing. The silence that followed was like a bottomless pit. Monsieur Poirot, said Dr. Artaud, leaning forward, that is a serious accusation. I'm not accusing you, Doctor, though you're not above reproach. But you— Poirot turned sharply to Pierre. You're the one who benefited from the old inheritance before Philippe revoked it. You, who were alone with the papers more than once. You, who had access to the pavilion through the garden window. Do you need me to show you the button on your jacket found under the hedge? Pierre paled. That doesn't prove I killed him. Poirot approached gently. No, but the letters do, and the bank records, and the amended will. Where your name, no longer appears, your silence, Monsieur Vignal, has been eloquent. But, like your trembling this morning upon receiving my letter, you can no longer maintain your facade. Pierre jumped up. It was all rightfully mine. I helped build that publishing house while Philippe squandered money in Paris. And when he discovered that neither you nor your ally would inherit. Poirot glanced briefly at Madame Vernet, whose face remained unchanged. He decided to make sure that the will would never be read. A long silence fell. Then, wordlessly, Pierre sank back into the armchair. Defeated, will he confess? Hastings asked quietly. He will. Maybe not today. But he will. He can't hold the mask any more. Poirot turned to the others. The crime has been revealed. And logic, once again, has led to the truth. And so, with imperturbable elegance, Poirot closed his briefcase. Now, all that remains is for justice to take its course, and for Philippe Davenay's soul to finally find rest. Chapter 6. Lies in the Mirror. The tension was just beginning to dissipate when Poirot left the drawing-room. Hastings followed him silently down the carpeted corridor until they both stopped in front of the library, where the Belgian detective deliberately closed the door behind them. "Do you really think Pierre did it all alone?" Hastings asked quietly, frowning. His reaction was that of a man cornered, but he didn't confess. Poirot sat down carefully in a straight-backed armchair and crossed his legs. No, my friend, Pierre wasn't the sole perpetrator of the crime. He was the mastermind. Yes, but not the mastermind. The plan we witnessed requires more than desperation. It requires calculation, cold-bloodedness, and a deep understanding of the emotional dynamics in this house. Hastings leaned forward. Are you referring to Madame Vernet? Exactly. Your composure doesn't impress me. It alarms me. You've controlled every element surrounding the crime, the suicide narrative, the staff's silence, even the opportunity to divert suspicion to others. Poirot stood up, walked to a bookshelf, and took out a book without looking at it. He just held it in his hand while he thought. Let's recall the scenario. Philippe, an uneasy heir, discovers irregularities. He changes his will. Suddenly he dies, and everything seems to point to a tragic and voluntary exit. But who benefits if the previous will is kept hidden? Vignal, yes. But who prevented the news from becoming public? Who had the influence, the resources, and the control over what happened within these walls? Poirot stopped and stared at Hastings. Madame Vernet never lost control. She only pretended to. That same day, Poirot asked to speak to Madame Vernet again. He found her in the sewing room, sitting in front of an unfinished piece of work, in the same chair where she had so often embroidered alongside her late husband. Madame Vernet, Poirot began rudely, I must ask you a direct question. She looked at him over her glasses, still moving the needle. Have we left elegance behind so soon, Monsieur Poirot? Elegance doesn't exclude truth. Did you know Philippe had changed the will? A slight hesitation in the needle, nothing more. I imagined it, but I didn't confirm it. He was very secretive lately. He had secrets. And you, don't you have one? More than would be prudent to confess, no doubt, but none that would make him a murderer. Perhaps not, but perhaps as an instigator. Pierre Vignal is ambitious, yes, but also loyal. To you, Madame Vernet stopped completely. She slowly put the needle back in the pincushion. What if that were the case? He said finally. Would it change anything? Philippe wasn't an innocent victim. He was a man who destroyed everything he touched. His father died a disgraced man. His fiancée lived in terror of his mood swings. He was a cancer to this house. Poirot didn't blink. And yet it was not up to you to decide his fate. She looked at him with a new hardness, as if the mask had finally cracked. The world is cruel, Monsieur Poirot. I only straightened it out a little. That afternoon, Poirot discreetly summoned Inspector Girard of the Chambéry police, who arrived out of uniform and without asking any questions. Poirot gave him copies of the bank documents, the button found in the hedge, Philippe's letters, and another envelope. And this last thing? Girard asked, examining the envelope. A recording. A dictaphone hidden in my briefcase during the conversation with Madame Vernet. She didn't know, of course. And it wasn't a direct confession, but it wasn't ambiguous either. Girard nodded seriously. And what do you want us to do? Summon Pierre Vignal for questioning. Press him. He'll talk. And when he does, he'll name the person he truly feared. Girard filed everything away without another word. He knew that, with Poirot, the results always came. Sometimes even before the police knew there was a crime to solve. That night, as the villa slept in silence, Poirot wrote in his black leather notebook, "The killer isn't always the one who wields the gun or dispenses the poison. Sometimes it's the one who convinces, manipulates, and directs the scene from outside the frame. In this house lies where the mirror of truth. What seemed like order was control. What seemed like composure was fear in disguise." He closed his notebook, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and turned off the lamp. He had discovered a lot, but not everything yet. Because the crime had been solved, yes, but justice still had to knock on the door. Chapter 7. The Flower That Never Opened. The next morning, the villa awoke strangely silent. The previous day's fog had returned, thicker and lower, as if the entire landscape were trying to conceal what was yet to be revealed. Poirot, already awake since before dawn, ate his breakfast in the greenhouse, while intently observing a rosebush that, despite the season, had yet to bloom. "Strange, isn't it, Hastings?" he commented as he stirred the sugar in his cup. "This rose promised beauty, and yet you didn't dare open it. Like some secrets, perhaps. A metaphor about Mrs. Vernet? Why not? Or about Léa Fauconnier? She too refuses to bloom. There's something she's holding back, something she hasn't said yet." Minutes later, as if her name had been summoned by the breeze, Léa appeared at the entrance to the greenhouse. Her face was pale, her lips pursed, and her hands tucked into her coat despite the pleasant temperature. "Mr. Poirot," he said bluntly, "I need to speak to you, privately." Hastings stood up, understanding. "I'll be in the library," he said, leaving, the door ajar. Poirot made a friendly gesture with his hand, inviting her to sit down. "What do you want to tell me, mademoiselle?" "I can't take it any more," she whispered. "Not with this silence. There's something I haven't told you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I was ashamed." Poirot remained silent, giving him space. 2 weeks ago, Philippe confessed something to me. He told me he'd received anonymous letters. They threatened him, yes, but also they tempted him. Someone offered him money if he gave up everything, if he left. "Disappear, and you'll have what you need," they told him. At first, he thought it was a joke, but the threats changed. They started talking about his past, about things only someone in this house could know. "Did he show you those letters?" "No. He burned them right in front of me. 'I don't want this poison to enter your world,' he told me. But that night he changed. He no longer slept. He no longer ate. He told me he was afraid he was being manipulated." Poirot leaned forward with sudden intensity. "Mademoiselle, do you think Philippe knew he was going to die?" Léa swallowed before answering. "Yes, I think he had accepted his fate, but not out of resignation, out of fear, and also out of a kind of defiance. I think he wanted to die leaving something behind that would explode after he left." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, like a time bomb in the shape of a will. "Yeah. And why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I thought that if you discovered the truth, you would also discover what Philippe asked me to keep quiet about." Poirot frowned. "And what was that?" She looked toward the door, as if afraid someone might hear. Philippe had a brother, illegitimate, son of the publisher Davenant, with a woman in Lyon. His name was never legally recognized, but Philippe discovered it by reviewing old papers. The true recipient of the new will was that brother, not Pierre, not me, a stranger. Poirot felt an essential piece fit together with a sharp click inside his mind. So, there it is. The fourth name on the draft will, the confidential A. Exactly. Philippe was looking for him. He wanted to right an injustice. But someone here figured out what he was trying to do, and they wouldn't let him. Hours later, Poirot met Hastings in the office. It all fits together, mon ami. Pierre was the executor, Madame Vernet the mastermind. But their fear wasn't losing money. It was having their husband's past exposed, a scandal that would have ruined the legacy he worked so hard to build. And the brother, does he really exist? I must confirm it. I've sent telegrams to Lyon. If that man is still alive, he'll be the last piece of the puzzle. Poirot stood up and walked to the window. The fog was beginning to dissipate, revealing the hedges and statues in the garden. The case is almost closed, and yet I feel like something's missing. A gesture, a reaction. Someone hasn't realized it yet. Do you think anyone else is involved? I think someone watched silently and remained silent, out of loyalty, out of fear, or out of love. Poirot turned to his briefcase and took out Philippe's diary. He flipped through it slowly until he found a sentence firmly underlined. What is not said weighs more than what is shouted. Hastings. I don't think that phrase was meant for the reader. It was meant for me. For you? Yes. Philippe knew they would call me if anything happened. He left me a warning. A silent signature. Now, I must listen to what hasn't yet been said. That evening, Poirot prepared one last scene. One more. Not in the great hall. Not in front of everyone. Alone on the terrace with a glass of wine, a lit lamp, and an empty chair in front of him. He'll come, Poirot murmured, looking at his watch. The guilty flee, but the accomplices, they always return, not out of remorse, but because they can't bear the weight of what they kept silent. Date. When the clock struck 11, footsteps crossed the garden. Someone else was about to speak. Chapter 8. The unexpected accomplice. The steps were soft, almost hesitant, as if each one of them hesitated to move forward. Poirot, who hadn't moved a single muscle since the chair was placed opposite his, kept his eyes fixed on the table lamp. The warm golden light illuminated the scene like a stage set, and he naturally was the only spectator. From across the garden, emerging from the shadows, appeared Odette, the maid. She wore a dark coat over her uniform, and her face was ashen. Seeing Poirot, she stopped, lowered her gaze, and stood there. She was trembling. "Come, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently. "The chair is there for you." She approached slowly, with stiff movements, and sat down, her hands twisted in her lap, as if trying to strangle each other. "You already know that, right?" she said, without looking at him. Poirot nodded slowly. "I've suspected it for 2 days, but now I'm sure, not of his guilt, but of his silence." She looked up, surprised. "Don't you think I killed him?" "No," You had no reason to do so, but you saw everything, didn't you? Or almost everything. That night, when you said you heard footsteps on the veranda, it was more than that, wasn't it? Odette closed her eyes as if replaying a painful scene. I went to leave the tray in Monsieur Vignal's room, but I stopped because I heard voices. They were low, but one of them, it was Madame Vernet's. She shouldn't have been there at that hour. Then I heard the door of the pavilion open. I hid behind the bushes in the hedge. Poirot did not interrupt her. I saw a figure enter the ward. It was her, Madame Vernet. She was carrying a box, small, like a jewel case. I wasn't there long. I got scared and ran back to the kitchen. I didn't want to know any more. I didn't want to see any more. But the next day when I learned that Philippe was dead, he understood, Poirot concluded sadly. And he decided to remain silent. Odette nodded, trembling. Why didn't he say anything? Because they wouldn't believe me. And because my sister works in Lyon, on a property that also belongs to Madame Vernet. I need this job. She gave it to me. She got me off the streets. What can I do against her? You are the truth, mademoiselle, and in this case, that's worth more than any title or fortune. A long silence fell between them. Poirot stood up, went to a side table, and poured a cup of tea. He placed it in front of her. You're not alone, Odette. The police will come tomorrow. They'll ask for your testimony. Don't deny it. Don't embellish it. Say what you saw. Don't be afraid. What if I get fired? If they do, said Poirot with a courteous smile, I'll find you a more dignified job myself. Perhaps in Paris. I have acquaintances in good hotels. People who appreciate honesty. She gave a shy smile and took the cup in both hands. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Later that night, Poirot retired to his room. Hastings waited for him, frowning and looking uneasy. The maid? Yes, she was the eyes that refused to see. And yet she saw the essential. She confirmed that Madame Vernet was in the ward before her death. That allows us to establish the key moment. And what about the illegitimate brother? Poirot sighed. The answers will arrive in the next few hours. The telegram from Lyon should be arriving soon. If that man exists, it will be the last crack in Madame Vernet's shield. Do you think he'll confess? No. Never. She's not one to give in. But her circle has closed. Pierre is collapsing. Odette will speak. The notary has the sealed will in his hands. When the police hear everything, there will be no more doubt. Poirot took his notebook and wrote a word at the top. The page control. This crime, he said softly, wasn't a crime of passion, Hastings. It was a strategy. A silent game of chess. Philippe wasn't killed out of hatred, but out of fear. Out of fear of what his decision would reveal. And like all important decisions, it touched too much pride in those who live by appearances. Leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced. Madame Vernet won. For years. She kept her house perfect, her past hidden, her power intact. But she forgot something. The fact that, Poirot smiled tiredly, that flowers, no matter how pruned, bloom in the end, and this truth, Hastings, has begun to open its petals. No one can stop it now. Chapter 9. The Echo of the Legacy. Dawn arrived with a pale clarity, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate the remnants of the lie that still weighed on Villa-Lavande. Poirot was already on his feet, dressed in his usual neatness. He was once again reviewing his correspondence on the small table in his bedroom. There, on a silver plate, a telegram awaited him, arriving from Lyon early in the morning. He opened it with a precise gesture, unfolding the sheet like someone unwrapping a crucial piece of evidence. Remy d'Abernay located, natural son of Lucien d'Abernay and Clémence Giraud, lives on Rue des Trois Ponts, Lyon, confirmed by notarial deed of 1904. Possible actual recipient of the will. Poirot breathed a sigh, not of relief, but of resolve. The brother existed, and with his existence, the last lie woven by Madame Vernet was beginning to unravel. At breakfast, faces were more rigid than usual. Pierre Vignal did not come down. Madame Vernet excused herself. Only Léa and Dr. Artaud were present. Hastings watched them both, while Poirot slowly savoured a tartine with orange marmalade. "Curious," Poirot said suddenly, in the casual tone of someone commenting on the weather. This morning, the police received a statement. Someone in this house finally dared to tell the truth. A statement that directly links Madame Vernet to the crime scene. Dr. Artaud placed his cup down on its saucer with a light tap. Léa looked at Poirot, alarmed. "Odette?" he asked in a whisper. Poirot nodded gently. "The maid." She feared for her job, but she feared more for her conscience. A deeply human reaction. "So, what happens now?" Artaud asked uncomfortably. "Mrs. Vernet will be questioned. She won't confess, of course, but that's no longer necessary. Every layer of this story has been peeled back. The will, the financial documents, Philippe's letter, Pierre's presence in the garden, and now confirmation of a legitimate heir, who has been hidden until now." Poirot laid his napkin on the table and stood up. "She won't go unpunished. She may not be arrested immediately. Justice may take another form, but balance has been restored." At mid-morning, Poirot asked to speak to Pierre Vignal for the last time. The young man, haggard and haggard, had lost all arrogance. He waited in the office like a man about to be sentenced. "Are you coming to tell me that you already know everything?" "No, I'm here to give it a chance." "About what?" "To free yourself. You didn't kill Philippe. You participated in the staging. You knew about the poison. You knew you had to fake a suicide." "Why?" Pierre lowered his gaze. His voice, when he spoke, was low and broken. "Because she saved me. When my father died, my family was ruined. Madame Vernet gave me a job, a purpose. I obeyed her like a mother. Philippe wanted to destroy everything, to ruin her name, drag her memory through the mud. She told me we should only scare him, that she would make him sign his silence. But then she went further. And you obeyed?" "Yes. I brought him the drugged tea. I didn't know he wouldn't wake up. I didn't think he'd go this far." Poirot remained impassive. "Remorse doesn't erase the crime, Monsieur Vignal, but your testimony can stop someone who still believes they've won." Pierre nodded, defeated. "I'll tell you what I know." That afternoon, Inspector Girard arrived at Villa-Lavande, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. Madame Vernet received them in the drawing-room as if on a social visit. She was impeccably dressed in dark blue. Not a wrinkle, not a hint of fear, Mrs. Vernet, Girard said firmly, you are formally summoned to testify in Chambéry, in connection with the death of Mr. Philippe d'Avenay. And if I refuse, you have the right to remain silent, but not the right to hide. I suggest you cooperate. Poirot, present in a corner of the room, watched silently. When she passed by him, their eyes met. All for one troubled boy, she whispered. Was he worth that much? Poirot replied with a single word. Yeah. That evening, Léa went out into the garden and found Poirot admiring the rose bushes. This time, one of the buds had finally begun to open. And now? She asked. Now, mademoiselle, the truth blooms, and, like every true flower, it has thorns. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, Thank you. Poirot bowed with a gentle smile. Not me. Philippe. He made sure we heard him, even the next day. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Name. 3 days later, the silence at Villa-le-Vent was not tense, but empty. The servants' footsteps sounded more hollow. The echo of the doors seemed deeper. Madame Vernet had not returned from her appointment with the police. Pierre Vignal, after testifying, had left without saying goodbye. Dr. Artaud had locked himself in his office, barely visible. Only Léa remained, as if she wanted to make sure the air in the house could breathe again. Poirot was still there, though no longer out of practical necessity. Justice had taken its course. The culprits had been identified, and yet the Belgian detective felt it wasn't quite over yet. Something else remained in the shadows. "Isn't it strange, Hastings?" he said one morning, as they walked along the side path that bordered the pond. "In this whole case, the true heir never appeared. We know he exists, we know his name, we know Philippe was looking for him. But until now, he hasn't said a word." "Are you referring to Rémy d'Avenay?" "Exactly. And today I'm going to meet him." The trip to Lyon was brief. Poirot, accompanied only by his cane and light grey coat, arrived at Rue des Trois Ponts just before noon. It was a modest neighbourhood full of whitewashed facades, old bakeries, and children playing on the sidewalks. Number 24 was a low house with green shutters. An elderly woman opened the door. "Monsieur Rémy d'Avenay?" asked Poirot politely. "Upstairs, second floor. You're home. Are you a police officer?" "No, madam, a broker of truth." He climbed the steps slowly. He knocked on the apartment door. After a few seconds, a young man with wavy brown hair and a serene gaze opened it. He was wearing a simple shirt, the sleeves rolled up. He looked more like a teacher than an heir. "Yeah, Monsieur d'Avenay. My name is Hercule Poirot. I'm here, regarding your brother, Philippe." The man's expression didn't change. It just grew firmer. "I knew this was coming. Come in." The apartment was humble but cosy. Books, an old radio, a coffee pot whistling on the stove. They sat down at the table. Poirot studied his face carefully. The same cheekbones as Philippe, the same high forehead, but without the frown. Rémy seemed a reflection of the brother he could have been. "Do you know why I'm here?" "Yes. Philippe wrote to me a month ago. He told me he was making changes, that he'd found documents, that he wanted to correct something." "And what did you do?" I replied. "But I never got his second letter, only the telegram announcing his death." Poirot nodded slowly. Philippe was trying to change his legacy. He wanted to name you as his legal heir. That's why they killed him. Not out of love, not out of revenge, out of fear of what his inclusion represented. Remy looked down. And what happens now? Legally, the will favours him. Although those involved tried to invalidate it, the document survived. He'll receive what his brother intended for him, and Ian's, you want to know if I'll accept it? Poirot didn't reply. He just waited. Remy stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the street as if he were expecting to see someone returning from a long journey. I've lived my entire life outside that name. No titles, no inheritances. I only learned a father existed when he was already dead. And now they tell me I have a fortune, that a brother I never met died protecting a right I never claimed. And you think it's unfair? I find it ironic, but also sad. Poirot approached him. Mr. Davenant, Philippe sought you out. He appointed you. In his last election, he wanted you to bear his surname, not as a symbol of power, but as a way to make amends for the past. Refusing that wouldn't make you more worthy. Accepting it might honour his memory. Remy was silent. Then he nodded. Once, I'll take it, but not for the money. I'll take it to finish what he started. At dusk, back at the villa, Poirot found Léa in the garden. She was carrying a book and a shawl around her shoulders. Any news? He asked. Poirot sat down next to her on the wrought iron bench. I found him. He's an honest man. He's not looking for fortune or revenge, just the truth. And that's enough. It's more than many have, mademoiselle. Léa smiled slightly. So, Philippe, in the end, you were right. Poirot looked toward the last rosebush in the garden. The flower he had never wanted to open was finally unfolding completely, as if the Bierdeburg light of that day had convinced it. Yes, she said softly. He knew that not all legacies are written in wills. Some blossom with time. Chapter 11. The last move. The air at Villa Lavande had changed. It wasn't lighter nor warmer. It was simply different, as if an invisible storm had swept through the corners, and now everything remained still, holding its breath. The servants walked with softer steps, and the echoes of conversations seemed to die away more quickly than usual. Poirot stood in the library before a portrait of the late publisher Lucien Davenant. The man's stern, classically drawn face gazed into the void with the same unshakable dignity his widow had sought to preserve until her dying day. Hastings entered, holding the day's newspaper. "It's on the front page," he said. "Madame Vernet, cited for fraud and complicity in the death of Philippe Davenant. Investigation open. Poirot didn't react immediately. He just raised an index finger, pointing at the portrait. He would have hated it all. The exposure, the scandal, the fact that the truth emerged like a drop of black ink on his pristine legacy. Do you think she did it out of love? For the love of order, of the name, of perfection? Madame Vernet didn't kill Philippe out of hatred. She did it because he altered her design of the world. To her, he was a piece of shit, and now the world moves on. But there's one more move left to make. That same day, Poirot wrote a letter. Not to the police, not to the notary. It was for Remy Davenant. Dear Mr. Davenant, I've thought long and hard about your brother's choice. You've received an inheritance more complex than titles and properties. You inherited an unfinished story. I invite you to come to Villa Lavande. There's something you must see. Something that isn't in documents or deeds, but that belongs to you by moral right. Your brother left more than papers. He left a living truth, and I think only you can fully understand it. The letter was sent that afternoon. Poirot, satisfied, allowed himself to go out to the neighbouring village for the first time in days. He bought some butter cookies from a bakery and a white rose from an unnamed florist. He placed it in his room, next to his briefcase. "A rose for the soul of the case," he murmured. 3 days later, Remy arrived. He was dressed just as before. Simple, unaffected. Poirot welcomed him into the library, where everything had begun, and where everything somehow had to come to a close. What did he want to show me? Poirot handed him a small leather notebook, different from the famous dated diary that had confused everyone. This one was older, with worn corners, handwritten by Philippe. His reflections, not for the world, but for himself. Remy flipped through the pages in silence. There were fragments of thoughts about justice, loneliness, family, and several entries devoted simply to the name R.D., followed by phrases like, "How do you build a relationship with a shadow?" and "Would you like chess? Will we have the same hatred for empty Sundays?" When she looked up, her eyes were wet. I never imagined that he would think of me like that. Poirot nodded solemnly. Philippe was a broken man, yes, but he tried to put a part of the world back together before he fell. This notebook is the only testimony without artifice. It wasn't manipulated, it wasn't forced. It's the only thing he wrote without thinking about who would read it. And what do you expect me to do with it? Nothing. Or everything. Read it, burn it, keep it. But know that this is your brother's real will, not the one signed before a notary, not the one sealed in envelopes. This one. Remy held the notebook like someone holding something fragile. I'll keep it. Then the case is over, Poirot said with a faint smile. Not in a court of law, but in the heart of the one who was meant to understand it. That night, Poirot packed in silence. Hastings watched him from the doorway. And now, Poirot, now we return home. I've done my part. The truth has been exposed, the masks have fallen, and the heir has found the missing piece of his story. And you? What do you get out of all this? Poirot turned to him. A flower, a name, and the certainty that, even when everything seems to have been said, the soul of a crime often speaks in the echo of silence. Chapter 12. Outcome in Ashquy. The train was leaving Chambéry for Paris. Poirot and Hastings occupied a private compartment, the sound of the wheels on the rails marking a steady rhythm, like a metronome marking the end of a long, sombre symphony. Poirot stood erect, as always, with his briefcase at his side and his gloves folded on his knees. He watched the landscape passing by the window, not for what it showed, but for what it didn't say. Hastings, with a copy of Les Figaro in his legs, broke the silence. So justice was done, Poirot? It's a balance, my friend. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's very close. Madame Vernet didn't confess, and she never will. Pierre Vignal was tried, yes, but he'll only serve a few years. His illegitimate brother has inherited a fortune he didn't ask for. And Philippe? What's left of him? Poirot clasped his hands. His final act remains. A sacrifice, if you will. He died without revenge, but not without a plan. He knew he couldn't confront the system from within, so he designed his farewell to speak for himself. Every false clue, every ambiguous word was intended for one reader, me. So you think he knew I would call him? I don't think so. I knew. He wrote his diary for me. He used the dates to confuse me at first, but also to point out that his death wasn't spontaneous. Philippe left no conventional clues because his mind wasn't conventional. He offered me a psychological puzzle, and I accepted the challenge. Hastings sighed, putting the newspaper aside. You never cease to amaze me, Poirot, and yet there's something that still bothers me. Did Madame Vernet plan everything alone, or was she merely a silent accomplice who allowed it to happen? Poirot slowly turned his head. A conspiracy doesn't always require words, Hastings. Sometimes all it takes is a shared glance, a convenient omission, an unspoken promise. Madame Vernet didn't push, but she opened the door. She gave permission. And that, in moral terms, is the same as acting. And his punishment? To live. With her work destroyed, her name in question, and the memory of her stepson haunting her in every empty corner of Villa Lavande. The train stopped briefly at Bourgoin-Jallieu. From the platform, a young man boarded and walked down the aisle next to Poirot's compartment. Hastings looked out and recognized him. Remy Davenet. He was carrying a leather satchel and a hat. Was that? Yes, said Poirot. The new owner of Villa Lavande. He's back to begin his part of the story. It's curious, isn't it? He didn't say a word as he passed, but you could see from his face that he understood everything. What will you do with the inheritance? According to the letter you sent me last night, you will transform the villa into a literary foundation in honor of Philippe, and also for his mother, Clémence Giraud, the two hidden lives of the past that will now have names, walls, and memories, a kind of redemption, a correction. Sometimes, Hastings, endings aren't written with condemnations, they're written with decisions. Hours later, back in his London apartment, Poirot left his briefcase in the hall, leisurely hung up his hat, and turned on his desk lamp. On top of it, he placed Philippe's original notebook, that undated diary that only he and Remy had read in full. He sat down, he lit his pen, and began to write in his own notebook. Case closed, the day after diary. A death calculated to become a message, a house where composure was a religion, a truth that flourished beneath layers of silence. The victim was, deep down, her own herald, and the killer, an architect of order. But there was also redemption, in a flower that refused to open, and finally did. Poirot put away his pen, turned off the lamp, and sat for a few moments longer. Then, in a barely audible voice, he muttered, "Goodbye, Mr. Davenet. May your truth continue to flourish, even when no one looks at it any more." And with that, Hercule Poirot closed the case.